Alrighty tighty folks, this video is going to be kind of stupid. Maybe. Perhaps. I did not get the footage that I should have for this whole thing, but you know what? I'm going through all of my raw footage, and I figured instead of just deleting it, I might as well use it for something. So, today we're gonna talk a little bit about the GM 6.0. It's a gasoline engine. These have a tendency to do a thing that we'll talk about here in a minute. We start with the diagnostics, right? So you see the computer there, you can see cylinder 2 misfire. Just, it runs up and up and up and up, and once it hits the end of the counter, it starts back over again. So after doing some diagnostics, I was mildly confused, I guess you could say, because it did not act 100% like what I ended up diagnosing it as, because there were some bits missing. So, let's get to... I guess let's talk about the diagnostic process first, and then I can tell you what the end prognosis was. So, step one is I get down to Arizona, and after the 4Runner was the work truck, Chevy 2500 HD 2-wheel drive. This came installed with the 6.0. Some people call it the 6.slow. It's not a super good engine. It's a modification of the technology that they've used for the Chevy 350 for the last 100 years or so. And there are things about this whole system, the engine, the transmission, the gearbox, everything about this truck. There are so many things that could have been amazing. They could have been phenomenal, and they simply weren't. That's a whole thing for another video. Ask me about it, maybe I'll tell you. So I get down there, and the complaint is constant misfire and low power. Okay, misfire equals low power. Easy correlation. So hook up the computer and we see it's misfire on cylinder number 2. Sometimes there's a misfire on cylinder number 4. That should have really given me an indication, but I wasn't making any calls prior to doing all of the diagnostics and making sure it fit the criteria for what was in my mind in the first place. So we pulled the plugs. He'd already replaced the plugs in the ignition coils, but I wanted to discount double check. So he pulled the plugs and checked them, and of course it's been a couple 100 miles since he replaced the plugs. The plugs are brand new, no issues with them, and nothing that you can read on the plugs that tells you anything based on their coloration or discoloration. 2, 4, and 6 all appeared to be running the same. Okay, so on to the next thing. Let's make sure that we are getting spark on cylinders 2 and or 4. So I swapped the coils from 6 and 8, the 2 in the back, to 2 and 4, and the misfire stayed on cylinder 2 with an occasional miss on 4. Okay, so it's not the coils. If it was the coils, the misfire would have moved to whatever cylinder I moved the bad coil to. That did not happen. So the next step was, okay, well, it's a misfire. What else can cause misfires on individual cylinders? So you go down the list of things that can cause that. Problem with the piston and the ring, which fairly unlikely. There's no knocking sounds, so it's unlikely that it's a push rod issue. It's possible, but it's unlikely. Or that it was a rod issue. There was no very high pressure in the crankcase, so not a hole in a piston. The other options are blown head gasket, which is weird to see at the front cylinder, which is why I was holding off on the diagnostic. Usually when I see blown head gasket, I see it in between cylinders, in the middle of the block and or the head. Because that's the hottest spot, that's the spot that warps the first and breaks the seal of the gasket, typically speaking. So what I did then was what you see right here, is I put a pressure tester on. I got the engine warm first because it was worse when it was warm. So I put the pressure tester on the cooling system, pumped it up with the engine warm and not running, and watched it for a few minutes, and it didn't move. Okay, so there's no coolant leaking out of the cooling system anywhere, apparently. Odd. That means probably not head gasket. Okay, so then I started the engine with the pressure tester hooked up, and the pressure went up a little bit, but not what I would normally expect to see from head gasket into the cooling system, right? Because you can get multiple ways that head gaskets fail. You can get coolant to oil failure and nothing in the cylinder. You can get cylinder to oil failure. You can get cylinder to coolant failure. You can have it fail very, very badly and have all three of them mixing together. That's never good. There was no, what we call in the automotive repair industry, chocolate milk, because it's milky and it looks like chocolate milk. If you get coolant and oil, water and oil in the crankcase mixing together, churning together in the crankshaft and what have you, all the moving bits, you end up getting this kind of frothy, milky kind of chocolate milk on the inside. So we checked that. Nothing. No chocolate milk. Okay. Still probably not head gasket. Whenever I diagnose a head gasket, most of the time it's pretty simple because of these things that are usually pretty clearly evident that the head gasket specifically has failed. None of those presented. The only diagnostic information that I had, the only thing that told me there was a problem, was the misfire on cylinder number 2 very badly, and sometimes cylinder number 4, and then the lack of power caused by not having a cylinder at all once the engine was warm. It was strange to me that it only did it when it was warm, though. So it was still in my head that it's possibly a head gasket. But again, not taking anything for chance, so I kept doing tests. And if you can't reproduce a failure, or you can't make the failure show itself clearly for what it is, you can do one of two things. You can do what most shops will do and throw parts at it until the failure has disappeared, which I do not do. There are some fairly rare cases where sometimes that is the cheaper solution, and that is the simpler solution, and that is the better solution for the customer, to throw a couple of cheaper parts at it to see when the failure stops. The last thing that makes it stop is the thing that was probably wrong. This kind of repair is not one of those, right? So we had to keep doing tests. So with the pressure tester on, we start the engine and we see the pressure rise just a little bit. That's normal because the water pump is now moving. It's a displacement device. It will provide some pressure in the system. And the heating of coolant will provide pressure in the system, and without the radiator cap installed, there's nowhere for that pressure to go. That's why we stick the pressure tester on and run the engine. Because if there's nowhere for it to go, the only place for it to go is either to burst a hose, which ideally you don't let the pressure rise that much, or into whatever orifice has opened up, whatever loss of sealing that has occurred, and verify that that's where it's going. I tried that here and it didn't work. I have had vehicles before that seemed to present with head gasket failures, but you couldn't easily tell that the head gasket was failed. This method has always proven to be kind of a fallback, almost a guarantee, that you could determine that the head gasket has failed. If you pressurize the system slightly over the cap pressurization level, which is 16 to 20 psi, depending on the vehicle usually, and see where the coolant's going. That did not occur here. So I was like, okay, well, maybe there's hydrocarbons in the cooling system and that will be our tell. So after failing to fully diagnose a head gasket failure with the pressure tester, we went out and we got a block tester. We just rented the one from O'Reilly's there in Sierra Vista, and we had to buy, because you can't rent the detection fluid because it's a consumable, and that wouldn't really make any sense. So we had to buy a bottle of the test fluid, which is a blue fluid that's I believe it's like a pH indicator. It detects combustion components. When combustion components are present in the cooling system, which they should never be under ideal circumstances, the fluid will turn yellow. And it's a fairly striking change from blue to yellow whenever that does occur, so it's pretty easy to tell. So we did that. And nothing. It told me nothing. What gave me sort of an indication that it most likely the kind of the I guess last straw for head gasket in my mind was what happened when I was testing for combustion components. And that is, we had the combustion tester on the surge tank with the test fluid inside the tube, the way you normally use it. I started the engine, and after a few moments, the coolant began overflowing out of the surge tank, pushed the combustion tester out of the surge tank, and luckily it didn't fall in the exhaust. That's what I was afraid of when it happened, was that it would fall in the exhaust and it would melt, and it's a rental tool, so then we'd have to buy it for twice as much as you could buy one in the first place, for whatever reason that they do such things. But I tried it with the engine off. We pumped it a few times. I didn't have any hope that that would give me anything, and of course it didn't. So you also don't want to pump it too many times and put a vacuum on the system, because then you can start sucking coolant into the combustion tester, and then you've just ruined your fluid. So don't do that. But we get in, we start it up, and you'll see very, very quickly after we start it up, the coolant just starts kind of volcanoing out of the surge tank. This has been, in recent years, something that I have discovered is a very good indication of either A, head gasket failure, or B, surge tank failure. The 3.7, 4.7, 5.7 Chrysler series, their modular, quote-unquote, modular engine series, the surge tank will fail and it will volcano. It will old reliable geyser straight up out of the surge tank if you're trying to bleed the cooling system if the surge tank has failed. Ask me how I know. Come to the Discord and ask me how I know. But, so we put the block tester on there, and you can see, still blue, still blue, still blue, and I release the little bit of vacuum that builds up from the pumping every couple of pumps just to make sure that we're not just going to suck coolant straight up into the block tester. And after a few minutes of idling, when it starts to get warm enough, what do we get? Wait for it! ran out of lung power. Shucks. What I ended up having to do to get this result specifically was to rev the engine to about 1500 RPM and hold it there for a moment. Under normal circumstances, you should be able to rev your engine, and even with the radiator cap or the surge tank cap off, nothing should happen. As the coolant expands, it should simply expand in the surge tank, and it should never overflow, because literally the whole purpose of the surge tank is to allow that space in a sealed system for expansion and contraction to occur. You can see right there, that's not me revving the crap out of the engine. I was holding the throttle at 1500, and you can see I'm now no longer holding the throttle because it's drive-by-wire, and it is still volcanoing out of the surge tank, right? In my experience, that is always a good indicator that A, the surge tank has failed. Don't ask me how. I have yet to figure that. I should really cut one of these things open and figure out exactly how that happens, because I have no idea. It's a plastic bottle. It makes no sense. I don't get it. But every time I have ever seen a vehicle that had overheating issues and the surge tank was bad, this is what I see. The volcano effect, or the geyser effect, I guess, because it's water, not lava, magma. Don't worry about it. But we actually had a 3.7 Liberty that would do this. We replaced the water pump, the thermostat, the head gaskets, because it had overheated into the red zone, so aluminum heads, head gaskets. We replaced the hoses, we replaced the radiator, we replaced the fan, we replaced everything. Every single part of the cooling system outside of the surge tank had been replaced, and it still continued to geyser out of the surge tank when you were trying to purge the system of air sort of the old-fashioned way, not with vacuum like most shops do now, but by letting it run and the air bubbling out. So if you ever need to figure out if your surge tank is bad, check for geysering. Moral of the story. That's it for my rambling. If you guys came by and checked it out, I appreciate y'all. Go check out the Discord in the description below. Don't forget to like it, subscribe it, crank it, and rip it. And we will see you in the next one.